The Knoxville Museum of Art is fortunate to have 9 of Mrs. Thorne's rooms that she made between 1931 and 1941. They were displayed all over the country, including at the Chicago Century of Progress Fair in 1933 and 1934, the 1939 Golden Gate Exhibition in San Francisco, and the New York World's Fair in 1940. In 1941, Mrs. Thorne gifted all of her rooms to the Chicago Institute of Art and included with that funding for their installation and their upkeep. In 1942, IBM purchased a set, and it was her first set of rooms, from the Chicago Institute of Art to add to their growing art collection. In 1962, IBM donated their Thorne rooms to 4 museums in the United States, including the Doolin Gallery of Art, which was just beginning as a museum. In fact, I believe that these were among the first actual art pieces that were owned by the Doolin. The Doolin is the predecessor to the Knoxville Museum, the present Knoxville Museum of Art. In 1965, Mrs. Thorne came to Knoxville to help with the installation of the room. According to a letter that her husband wrote IBM when they purchased the rooms, and the letter was written in 1943, quote, "She found from experience that the installation of the objects cannot always be safely delegated to others. Her precise touch often means the difference between having everything just right or all wrong." In 1990, the KMA opened in World's Fair Park. At that point, the rooms were in need of a lot of conservation. The light had helped deteriorate some of the fabrics and the colors and such. So they were put in environmentally controlled storage. In 2006, in honor of her mother-in-law, a Knoxville resident, Sherry Lee, funded the restoration and installation of the Thorne rooms into the museum. Eva Sander Conwell of Chattanooga was a conservator who, with utmost care, repaired and cleaned the rooms, but did not replace any of the items with new copies. Also, at this point, the new state-of-the-art lighting was included in hopes that the light would not deteriorate the rooms. They have been on permanent display at the Knoxville Museum of Art since then. To appreciate the Thorne rooms, we need to know a little more about Mrs. Thorne. Narcissa Niblack was born in 1882 in Vincennes, Indiana, and at the age of 8, she and her family moved to Chicago. She received her first dollhouse when she was 5, and it was 4 rooms and apparently must have been 2 floors worth. And at the time, amazingly enough for a 5-year-old, she was upset by the proportions and the fact that there was no stairway. Later in her life, she commented, "The general effect has offended my sense of beauty and scale." Her collection was inspired by her uncle Albert Niblack, who was a rear admiral in the Navy and traveled the world. She described him as a tall, jolly man who loved teeny-weeny things. He brought Narcissa miniatures as gifts from his travels around the world. These she treasured greatly and very carefully stored them in boxes. Then she would bring them out and look at them periodically. And finally, one Christmas, her mother gifted her with a small, glass-fronted, 4-shelf mahogany cabinet in which she displayed her collection. In 1901, she married James Ward Thorne, her childhood sweetheart. He was the son of one of the founders of the Montgomery Ward Company, which was the first general merchandise mail-order catalog company in the country. Together, they loved working with their hands and decided to build dollhouses. They built them for family and friends, orphanages, children's homes, charitable events, and never took any money for them. In fact, this was the beginning of their life together as great philanthropists. Narcissa was a student of architecture and design and had quite a collection of books on architecture, furniture, and interiors. She in fact donated those to the Chicago Institute of Art. And she also designed rooms in her home after 17th and 18th century European rooms. She and James traveled extensively in Europe. He was an amateur photographer and would take pictures of the various chateaus, palaces, and homes that they visited while they were in Europe. She also was purchasing miniatures on her trip. In fact, she purchased so many that her husband had to go out and buy an extra trunk for her to get her miniatures at home, over 100 of them. She packed them very carefully in the trunk and got some strange looks from the customs officers when they landed in New York on their return. She had seen so many complete rooms and museums that were recreations or actually rooms that were moved there, for instance, in places like Williamsburg, that she decided to make miniature museum quality period rooms. She gave great attention to the scale, design features, and furniture style. She wanted architecture students to be able to visit historic rooms without the expense of travel. And the other reason that she liked the idea of making these architecturally correct rooms was that she had a place to put her various pieces from her collection in and didn't have to worry about them being broken by a child who was playing with a dollhouse. She continued working on her rooms until just a few months before her death in 1966. Mrs. Thorne made 3 sets of rooms between 1931 and 1941. The first included 29 rooms that were inspired by her own collection of miniatures. The second was of 31 period rooms of European architecture and design, and the third were 37 rooms that, as she referred to, were a doll's eye view of American history from 1675 to 1940. All of them are important, vivid records of European and American interiors. And, interestingly enough, all are to the scale of 1 inch to 1 foot. That scale actually became a standard for other miniaturists. Our 9 rooms come from the first set that she made. They contain treasures from her earliest years of collecting and are totally inspired by her collection. She designed the rooms and actually drew blueprints for them and had a carpenter build the shelves to her specifications. She painted and stained the woodwork, made curtains and carpets, upholstered furniture, painted murals and outside scenes. Even with her large collection, there were gaps in the pieces that she wanted for her rooms, so she commissioned craftsmen to make small-scale copies of museum pieces that fit with her antiques. Her ingenuity and creativity guided her use of everyday objects in unusual ways. For example, a watch crystal became a mirror, chessmen became busts, handkerchiefs became curtains, box top became rugs, magazine pictures became portraits, round toothpicks became candles. When nearly finished with her first 12 rooms, she found that they were flat and lifeless. She looked carefully at them and saw that, yes, the windows had glass in them and the curtains were totally the correct design and scale, but there was no light shining through. Her chauffeur of 45 years actually helped her solve that problem by suggesting that she put a light bulb near the window opening. This, she discovered, became sunlight shining in through the windows and gave her rooms a third dimension. She continued using that particular process on her other rooms. And as you're looking at the Thorne rooms, look out the windows. She not only has murals that she's painted, but she's also made some gardens and various things to see. They are fantastic. Now let's look at some specific rooms. Let's start with the Victorian parlor that is English, dated around 1850. The hallmark of the Victorian period was comfort and coziness. They had always had lots of what we would refer to as bric-a-brac around. The furniture in this room was actually taken from an old English dollhouse. It was made for play, built a little thicker and sturdier, and much more overall heavier than some of the pieces that she had created and actually collected. But when she was finished with the room, she decided that they actually added to the feeling of coziness. Note as you're looking around the room some of the trinkets. For instance, on the desk on the left is a Rockingham pottery lamb. Rockingham pottery was a well-known British pottery that a lot of people owned pieces from. And also note the wax flowers under the dome on the table in the center of the room. The chandelier has an interesting story behind it. She had the gas globes hand blown, but had a hard time figuring out how she was going to recreate the prisms that were hanging on the chandelier. And one day she was walking in Chicago and decided to go into a Woolworth's 5 and dime. There she found, the first counter she went to was the jewelry counter, and she found necklaces that were perfect. She bought 20 of them, and apparently the sales girl was a little confused by why she was buying 20 of these necklaces. Apparently there is a newspaper in the magazine rack that was made for Queen Mary's dollhouse in 1924 and is an exact replica of the 1924 London Times that apparently can be read with a magnifying glass. Queen Mary's dollhouse is on display in Windsor Castle for all to see. And remember to look out the windows and you can see a foggy London street scene. The next room I want to talk about is the American Summer Kitchen, 1885. At that point, the kitchens were set aside from the house to protect the house from both the heat during the summer as well as fire possibilities. Note that this room has a tall ceiling and the walls are painted white to give it a much cooler atmosphere. This room was inspired by the toy water pump, which you can see outside the screen door. And notice as you're looking out the door that there is a good luck horseshoe over the door. The stove is also a toy, but quite accurate. And actually, I had a tour one day there, and one of the gentlemen said, "Oh, that stove is exactly like my grandma's stove. I can still taste the cornbread that she made on it." By the wash bowl hanging on the wall are a comb and brush, so that the gentleman coming in from working outside could wash up and neaten up before eating. And there is a roller towel next to it that they would pull around so that the next person would have a dry spot on the towel to use. The curtains are made of a handkerchief. And note, there is a small cat sitting by the stove. The table has a Montgomery Ward catalog on it. And there is also a jar with donuts. Those donuts are really toy car tires that Mrs. Thorne painted brown and dusted with baking soda. Very creative. The Spanish bedroom is 16th century. Is done in the Spanish Renaissance style, which is really a mix of Gothic and Italian Renaissance with some Moorish influences. And as you look at this room, or at least as I look at this room, I think it must be very chilly outside. There is a wrought iron brazier in the middle of the floor, which was used to dispel the winter chills. The bed is surrounded by heavy curtains, which would be drawn at night to keep the winter chill out. Further, the room is, the walls and the windows are covered with gold brocade, and red velvet, which actually came from an upholstered Spanish chair, is draped on the dresser and over the bed. The headboard of the bed is an antique gold mantilla comb that's been embellished with carved ivory, coral, and mother of pearl. One thing that I really notice are the lamps beside the bed and the fireplace screen are wrought iron and are in a Moorish design and are very much more delicate than kind of the feel of the rest of the room. A story behind the wrought ironwork was that the Thornes built a summer home, a vacation home in Santa Barbara, California. And while they were there, Mrs. Thorne found some very skilled artisans to help. She had a Mexican actually reproduce the wrought iron from photographs, pictures, and drawings that she had. And she also found an Italian wood carver who she convinced to give her wood carving lessons. And together they made pieces for her Italian and Spanish rooms. To continue with our Spanish theme, let's look at the Majorcan kitchen. Majorca is an island midway between North Africa and Barcelona. It is known primarily for the Majolica pottery, which was very colorful, and actually can be seen examples of it on the mantelpiece. The buildings were made of stone or stucco with very high ceilings to help protect from the year-round heat that Majorca experienced. This is obviously a farmhouse, as you can see wooden shoes with tools by the door on the right, and has a Moorish influence on it with the tiles behind the cement bench on the left and the arched windows. The wine jugs and water jars that Mrs. Thorne bought when she and her husband visited Orvieto, Italy. When she saw them, they reminded her of a picture she'd seen of a Majorcan kitchen. Hence, she made a Majorcan kitchen. Note the figure in the corner. Only 3 of her rooms have figures, unless you count the cat in our summer kitchen. They were all kitchen scenes. We actually have 2 of them. This one, the Majorcan kitchen, the early American kitchen, and the 3rd one, which is in the Phoenix Museum of Art, is the Breton kitchen. She felt after she had finished these rooms that the figures actually detracted from the main purpose of her doing the rooms, so she stopped putting figures in her rooms. With apologies to Marianne Malone and her book 68 Rooms, I suggest when you look at the Thorne rooms, think of yourself as 5 inches tall, able to explore the room, opening drawers and doors and going outside, and perhaps, like her characters, you too can become a part of that time in history.